With Deltarune's chapters 3 and 4 finally released, we've finally been able to see the continuation of something that was one of the most prospective parts of Deltarune, that being the Weird Root. And basically, all of our Chapter 3 Weird Root predictions were completely off the mark, and Chapter 4 especially had some really wild stuff. Most of our predictions centered around getting Toriel or some other character to kill a bunch of Darkners again and psychologically exploit them, but those predictions have completely fallen to the wayside. Personally, I predicted that the Weird Root was going to devolve from what it was originally set up as, and have more to do with game breaking in general, like going out of bounds or skipping cutscenes and the like, but I was also pretty wrong on that front too. And so because all of our predictions ended up like this, I think it's best that we pick up the pieces from here and put back together just what the Weird Root is doing. I think one of the things that really screwed up many of the fandom's predictions was a fundamental misunderstanding about the Weird Root, which these new chapters have communicated much more directly. That being that Noelle is intrinsically tied to the Weird Root. The Chapter 3 mini Weird Root that essentially served as a tutorial and retread of the Weird Root with the same gimmick of an ice character freezing everyone pretty much already gave this away. And the fact that nothing else outside of Noelle is pertinent to the Weird Root so far also displays this. But that final Chapter 4 scene in the Weird Root more than anything else really cements her relevance to the root. Which, by the way, this has to be one of the single most fucked up scenes in the game so far. With this one scene alone, I think I experienced more discomfort here than I did at any other point before in Chapter 2's darker segments in the Weird Root. And trust me, there is a lot to talk about here. One of the main parts of the scene is the Thorn Ring, since you have to equip it onto Noelle, which I find interesting. The trance effect it was described as having before kind of signifies just how much he's under our control, even to the point where Noelle is implied to be thankful for it. Although whether that's permanent for the rest of the game is unclear. This scene has also become extremely controversial within the fandom due to a certain aspect of it, which got changed a few times by Toby just from the backlash from it. And that is that the implication from this scene is sexual assault. Before getting into this, I need to preface that this is a pretty serious matter, and one that has not been tackled the best by our fandom. For my personal opinion on this matter, I think the scene at the very least is definitely an allegory for that. The scene itself is definitely a little vague towards the end, but despite that, I think it's important to recognize that no, Toby isn't going to depict actual assault in his game. I hope we all understand this. But what we see in the scene is definitely meant to be allegorical to it. In this one scene, you entirely strip away the innocent naivety that Noelle had that the events of Chapter 2 were merely just a dream, and you take away her innocence. The thorn ring that's used in this scene sort of sells this allegory, and other series have literally used thorn rings before to convey a very similar message. And overall, it just matches with the Weird Root's generally abusive romantic undertones. The imagery Toby originally showed at the end of the scene, which he had to change later, was of a wilting rose, and I think that also matches with those romantic undertones. This scene itself and some other stuff also aligns with what others have suggested. I've seen many people suggest that what we're doing currently is to make Noelle some hollow vessel for the player, and honestly, I somewhat agree with this. The Weird Root itself is largely about ignoring the agency of characters in order to gain a sense of control. You essentially forsake the world and every other character's agency to try and gain back your own. So the idea of trying to forge a hollow vessel that you can perfectly control without any pushback definitely seems in line with what's happening in the root. On this note, the vessel could also be relevant to this. After all, the vessel could be pretty thematically relevant if the Weird Root is really about trying to forge an unfeeling, unresisting entity that carries out our will perfectly. Although exactly how the vessel would get involved in this, I'm unsure about, but I still think it's worth some thought. A common theory about the Weird Root I've seen a lot now is that it's the original prophecy of the Deltarune. This idea gains a bit of merit considering how the Chapter 3 mini Weird Root focuses on the original game that Tenna has rebranded. And this could parallel the Weird Root being the original prophecy, especially since the mini Weird Root has a large focus on retreading the actual Weird Root. Ultimately though, I don't really think that's the truth. I doubt Toby would have a route where you exploit a mentally fragile girl into committing mass fictional genocide as the path to the original prophecy. The Weird Root likely falls more under what Gerson was talking about in Chapter 4, a reinterpretation of the prophecy. Many have already speculated that the heroes within the prophecy aren't so cut and dry, and may not be who we think they are. The second girl is commonly speculated to be Noelle and not Susie, contrary to what Susie herself believes, although I'm not certain if we're meant to take it that way entirely. The second girl is described as the girl with hope crossed on her heart, after all, and that is a much more apt description for Susie rather than Noelle. Although conversely, the weird route may be about changing who the second girl is, so the girl who finds love is different depending on if you do the normal or weird route. Although honestly, this is a bit of a toss-up for me because I think arguments for Susie and Noelle being the second girl are both about as valid to me. The idea that the prophecy's second girl may be changing especially is interesting considering how Chapter 4's end seems to allude to Chris going to the festival with Noelle, which may be what is the biggest change from the prophecy, since in the actual prophecy, Susie and Noelle are probably supposed to be the ones going to the festival together. It's likely this change is actually what changes the identity of the second girl, since Susie's love as the second girl has been shifted and thus the roles on the prophecy are altered. Ultimately, though, the irony of the weird route is likely going to be that this is merely a reinterpretation of the prophecy. The weird route largely seems to be about trying to gain choice in a game lacking significant choice, and that theme is especially prominent given the whole weird route's glitch hunting, creepypasta-esque vibe that's focused on trying to break the game. This point is not unique to me, but I don't think it's any coincidence that the character tied to the weird route, Noelle, is also an avid game breaker and glitch hunter. Chapter 2 in general has a horror creepypasta vibe to the whole affair, and the Chapter 4 scene of the dialogue choices going empty and the screen tinting red really exemplifies just how the weird route is so focused on glitches and creepypasta. But of course, regardless of how much we try to break the prophecy and reinterpret it to gain agency, I doubt that the ending will actually change. The tragic irony of the weird route seems to be focused on how in spite of your efforts to break the game, you can never alter how it was supposed to end. And in that effort, you mentally fuck over the cast heavily. It's essentially a question of how far you will throw away your suspension of disbelief for this world in order to gain something new out of it. Then again, there is always a possibility that you'll be able to break the prophecy through the weird route, since that's what Rousey sort of alludes to, but I personally feel it'd be more thematically appropriate if things remain the same. Especially since I feel like breaking the prophecy should be awarded to characters like Susie who are built up to be able to do so, rather than the player with malicious intentions. More than anything, it just seems better to not reward the player for doing this, but depending on the direction it goes, I think it could work. Rousey's dialogues near the end of Chapter 4 about fearing something outside of the prophecy that could be worse could be alluding to the ending being different, but one that's worse from the original. I don't dislike the idea thematically either of having a route where you break the game only to get a worse ending, just to feel any semblance of choice. But this is the point I'm way less certain on, so for now just take what I say here with a grain of salt. Although in the end, I wonder just how much characters are actually going to notice what you're doing. In chapters 1 and 2, characters like Susie and Rousey seemed pretty oblivious to what you're actually doing. But chapter 4 especially so far has really begun to set up other characters knowing about the actions you're taking with Noelle. As I mentioned before, Chapter 4 already has a scene where Susie questions what actually happened between Chris and Noelle, and in general starts to be more aware of how weird Noelle has been lately, but still doesn't really know what's going on. And that's of course beyond the whole "this took a weird route" line. Rousey is also very much implied to know generally that something strange is going on. He comments that taking Noelle to the festival is a bad choice to Chris on the weird route. And in the weird route specifically, he also worries about if a path taken outside the prophecy could be worse than just following the prophecy. In general, there seems to be a progression in terms of characters becoming more aware of our actions. Combined with characters like Susie probably learning later on about Chris's situation, and I really wonder just how far it will go before characters start actually taking action on what's happening. I've seen the idea of a Susie weird route boss fight being tossed around a few times, and as a conclusion to this progression, I think it works wonderfully by the end when the characters start understanding what's actually going on. Although I'm still a little hesitant about this, because again, I'm a bit unsure about just how much the weird route will actually diverge from the normal path and if it would be to this extreme. Regardless, the main cast acknowledging our presence more at least will likely evolve in future chapters. Beyond just all of the psychological horror with Noelle, the weird route also has a strangely cosmic horror within it. And what I mean here is that the narrative trudges on largely the same, regardless of anything else that's happening within the side plots, which can even include things as important as Birdley's death, or comatose anyways. Strangely enough, it harkens me all the way back to Undertale, and about that question that Goner Kid poses about whether you could exist in a world and no one else would notice. And it also sort of brings back the "you don't matter" message that Deltarune front-loaded very early on. But it's not about the actual important characters within the prophecy, it's specifically on side characters who play a minor role within the tale. who no matter what cannot have a major impact on the narrative, even in spite of what's happening to characters like Birdley. In general, this has sort of been a running theme across the chapters, given how the lives of many Darkners are actually at stake depending on your choices, but because they have lost their relevance, they don't really matter. It makes me wonder whether or not Birdley's condition will actually be focused on more or not, and on if the story will illogically cast it aside and rewrite it to make it work. It also makes me wonder whether or not we'll see this further on in the Weird Route, where bigger changes happen to other Lightners that the narrative ultimately moves past because they don't matter to the prophecy. There's a very unique, cosmic, existentialist horror regarding being a side character who is unimportant and can be easily cast aside. And whether the Weird Route, or even just a normal game, further extrapolate on this is a very interesting point to consider. But with all that said, that's basically most of my current thoughts regarding the Weird Route. If you haven't noticed by now, this video is mostly just me rambling because I have a lot to say and no coherency on what I have to say. The Weird Route especially is just really difficult to talk about given just how, well, weird it is compared to anything else in the game. There's almost nothing consistent about its depiction, and in general, it's just a labyrinth of weird steps and sequences that lead to equally weird results. That's probably the point, but it makes it weird to talk about, especially when compared to something like Undertale's Genocide route, which had a pretty clear through line in its meta commentary. The whole uncertain nature of the route makes it really difficult to pin down just what Toby actually intends to do with it, but that also makes it really exciting to see where it goes. Regardless, if you enjoyed this video, then please consider liking and subscribing to the channel, because all the support really does help boost my small channel in the YouTube algorithm. If you have your own thoughts on the Weird Route, or just Deltarune in general, then please leave them down in the comments below. But other than that, take care.